Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sharpe Takes, where we look at public education, where we are now, where we want to be, how do we get there, and how do we pay for it. I'm delighted today to have as my guest Deb Brighton, who is probably the most knowledgeable person about tax policy in general and education taxes in particular. So welcome, Deb. I really
Thanks.
appreciate your willingness to come on the show.
Thank you.
So, where are we now with regard to education taxes and taxes in general? I noticed on my Google search that you did quite a bit of work around that in 2021 as a part of the latest version of a tax commission.
Where we are right now, I would say in major flux.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's almost hard to say where we are sort of day to day. It's changing, but yeah,
Yeah.
I think this is the most major change we've had since Act 60, which is 25 years ago.
yes, right. And it could be back to the future if we go to a foundation formula, which looks like the legislation is edging in that direction.
That's right. That was a foundation formula that we had right before Act 60.
Yeah, that was thrown out by the
That was
Supreme
thrown out.
Court
Yep.
and resulted in the efforts. And I didn't realize it, or I understood better doing a little work this morning with that. Paul Celo and the tax committee back then actually initially proposed an income-based system for collecting education taxes, vehemently opposed by Howard Dean, governor at the time. And now we are back to the future in the sense that the Public Assets Institute, and my understanding is that the Tax Commission you were on in 2011 both now recommend a change to the income tax system for paying for education.
Yes, I mean, I think that's true. I think the legislature, though, has pretty much decided not to do that. And in fact, to have income be even less important than it has been under Act 60.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that both public assets and the tax commission felt that moving to income was so important was for a bunch of reasons. Partly that it's much fairer at getting at the ability to pay, but also that we're sort of over-reliant on the property tax, and that's really the hardest tax for people to pay very often.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's so out of sync with income and ability to pay.
And I often refer to it as the bomb that goes off in your mailbox. Other taxes, income and sales taxes, yes, we pay a lot in regard to those taxes as well, but they kind of leak out and we don't really notice it so much. And then for many people, when tax season comes along, which it is right now, we're in the midst of tax season, people are looking forward to checks because they've overpaid their income taxes and they're looking for a tax rebate come April 15th. So the income tax and the sales tax seem less onerous than the property tax and more able to pay because you don't have to like open up your checkbook on April 1st and write a check for $5,000 or give or take. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons why property taxes are difficult. One of the things that I heard from Public Assets, Steph, you, if I pronounced her name properly, is that one of the things that could be done is to properly inflate the $47,000 threshold and the $90,000 threshold. Yet I heard from a senator that's somewhat knowledgeable that she's heard the numbers and they don't work. So I don't know about that. Can you help me understand those thresholds and what should or could be done with them?
Right. I guess I guess this always happens, but when we started out, you sort of have the concept that you're going to go to income, and that people are going to pay their education taxes based on their income. It sounds simple, and then you start figuring out that there's sort of unintended consequences, or maybe it's too expensive, or maybe it's too generous, or whatever. And so we started putting in these little cut points.
Yeah.
And so at one point we said you pay on income up to $97,000, and then at that point you only count a portion. It only takes care of a portion of your house value, or whatever, And $90,000 was really high. That one point,
yeah.
And then $90,000 doesn't end up being as high over the years. And then, but we've also added different little caps, changing the amount of house value of your property that you could exchange for income. Or you mentioned the $47,000 one. We've had a special credit for households making less than $47,000. We haven't changed that in a long time either.
That's been decades, has it not? That preceded Act 60.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right, so $47,000 was a reasonable amount of money at that time, and so we didn't change any of those. We simply added more. And I think that the reason, if someone said that it doesn't work to move those up, is simply that people would be paying more money. In other words, somebody over 90,000 now is paying less, and if we move the 90,000 up to say 110, that person would continue to have a break rather than.
Someone else would have to pay more. Presumably, people with incomes higher than 110 in that example. Is that right?
Well, so right now we're giving people, say, a higher break if their income is less than 90,000. And then when there was one example that came to the tax commission that somebody's income went between 89,000 and 91,000 or something, and their property tax bill doubled.
Yeah, right.
And so essentially, if we moved that line from 90,000 to 110,000, that person's property tax bill wouldn't have doubled.
Right.
So
it'd go up a little tiny bit.
A tiny bit instead of doubling. So the state would be losing more money,
in order to collect as much, but they'd still have to collect as much in the education fund, right?
So that therefore they'd have to raise the rates on everybody.
So the basic rate would increase, both on income, presumably both on income and property.
That's right. We said in current law, we've asked the tax commissioner to make sure that both the income tax bills and property tax bills go up or down the same percentage.
Yeah. So overall, sort of thinking about it, if we did that, I think if we inflated those $47,000 and $90,000 thresholds to today's dollars, that would be a pretty significant increase, I think, particularly for the $47,000 one because it's so old. So let's say the 47 goes to 57 and the 90 goes to 150. So then we're going to have to, in order to make the education fund whole and be able to pay schools the money that they've voted for, the basic rates, income and property tax rates would increase. So what would help me understand what would that mean for, the broad spectrum of taxpayers? Would on education taxes, would wealthier people begin to pay a higher share of their income in taxes because the base property tax rates would go up? And would it tend to level the playing field, or doesn't it really make any difference?
The rate would go up for everybody.
Right.
So it would go up for the lower
income payers
lower
as
income.
well. Yeah.
income payers too. And then there were some other little numbers in there too, sort of like the maximum value of your house site that you could trade for income and things like that. Those would have to be increased too, because houses are also more valuable. So
that area, it seems particularly disturbing to me because, my house in Bristol is worth $250,000. My house in South Burlington, it'd be worth $550,000, and yet the cutoff is like $400,000 for a house value. So I don't think somebody living in my house in South Burlington is necessarily going to make that much more money than I do. So it seems like that having one number for across the entire state just is not particularly fair. It doesn't really work. Am I off base here?
No, that's one of the problems with the property tax in general is the difference in the property tax that you'd pay on the same house in say Stowe, and then in Waterbury, could be very different. And that's one of the reasons that some of the property wealthy towns actually liked going to an income tax, because income is really the ability to pay. You could be the same income living in the same house, but in a different location and have a very different property value.
Yeah. Just because property values in Stowe are very high, property values in Stowe are very high, doesn't mean that incomes across the spectrum in Stowe are very high.
That's right.
There are low-income people in Stowe as well as high-income people.
Well, you want them to be able to live there.
Sure. Yeah. So, given the reality that it's unlikely for, I'll put it the other way, that it's more likely that the legislature now is going to move to this enhanced, if you will, foundation formula.
Mm-hmm.
How can that be made to be equitable? How can we attain more equitability, if that's a word, equity across schools and age groups and communities with the foundation formula?
I think that the foundation formula itself isn't the equity problem, really, and that it could be funded with income. It could be funded with property.
I see.
If you consider property as being fair, a fair measure of the ability to pay in the first place.
Yeah.
But in terms of maintaining equity in property tax rates for spending, you could use a foundation formula, and that will just be a flat rate to achieve the foundation amount everywhere. So there wouldn't be that disparity between districts. That was one of the problems that the Supreme Court dealt with.
Right.
So wouldn't have that. The governor's proposal for spending above the foundation amount would have had disparities between districts because it was going back to the tax base of the individual districts.
Right.
So some districts would be able to raise extra spending more easily than other districts, or with a lower tax rate.
Right.
The House Ways and Means Committee has proposed having that excess spending go on a yield, similar to what we have now, so that if your excess spending were, say, $2,000 a pupil, you would have the same tax rate, property tax in this case, but the same tax rate, no matter what district you were in.
And then it would be like, okay, so foundation formula is money out of the ed fund into communities, right? So we still have to fill the ed fund with taxes.
Yeah.
So we would continue to use the House Ways and Committee has proposed that we continue to use the same sort of funding system for the education fund.
Yes, you mean all of the other non-property tax revenues and things, and then a base rate, a flat rate that everyone pays
Yeah,
to get the foundation amount per pupil sent to the district.
yeah. And then anything over the foundation amount would be raised through the Act 60 mechanism.
With the yield, yes. And it would be sort of similar. There was an excess spending penalty. I think we've always done this, which is maybe it's sort of send a message, but there's always been an idea of here's a base amount and then there's the spending above that.
Yeah.
And so any spending above the foundation amount would be excess spending, and it's sort of considered an excess spending penalty in that it's harder to raise.
Yeah.
So they figured out that they're going to put the yield in as what the district with the lowest tax capacity, meaning the least grand list per pupil, what they're able to raise on, say, 80 cents, how much they'd raise per pupil on 80 cents. And so that would be the yield.
Yeah.
So then it would mean that everybody, including the lowest district that spent over that foundation amount, would raise a property tax that would exceed the amount that they're going to get out of the ed fund.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the penalty.
So what you're bringing up is also a concern of mine, that this, whatever this foundation amount is, I think the big impetus from some of the people who've been here on the show, one of the big impetuses for doing this is that there are 5 school districts. The weighting study went into place, which I want to talk a little bit about the weighting study, but the weighting study went into place, and that shifted tax in a major way in some communities. There were 5 districts. I'm told there are 5 districts where the extra tax capacity that was sort of a notion in the weighting study was it would create extra tax capacity, so low spending communities would have more money to spend on low income students. But that didn't happen in 5 districts. What they did was they used that tax capacity to lower rates rather than bring more resources to low income kids. So I think that's right. So then the notion is, okay, with the foundation formula, we're going to actually give those communities money and to actually educate those low-income kids, which is a great notion, except that if the foundation amount doesn't increase resources for those low-income kids, we haven't accomplished anything. Am I thinking right, or where am I missing?
No, I think you're correct. I mean, essentially, we're not telling a district that they have to spend this amount on, we're not breaking it down to say on lower income kids, or you spend this amount on
English language learners, whatever.
At this point. And so the weights weren't really tied to a particular program. It wasn't the poverty weight wasn't saying you need X hours of tutoring or something.
Right.
But the sort of the evidence-based approach that's being used is really looking at what you need to spend on students, for various things.
Categories,
Yeah. But we're not mandating that.
So we don't typically mandate stuff at the state level in terms of what school districts have to do, even to the extent of curriculum. We leave that pretty much up to school districts. I think there are some guidelines in place, maybe, and I think there's some notion of giving more power at the state level. The governor sees it in the agency. I think the Education Committee in the legislature sees it going to the State Board of Education. In either case, more power to dictate, if you will, what kind of services or curriculum that school districts have to provide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. And I think so we don't really know how the weights are going to work. I think it will take a while of seeing what actually happens. If in the first year we don't see more money going, that the lower spending districts had spent more money or whatever, I don't think that means necessarily that the weighting hasn't worked. It's just the change.
Yeah. No, my inclination is to think that the weightings did work, that it really made a huge balancing, readjusting the balance of resources available to low-income kids and English language learners. I think the work that was done around that. Do you think the weights are right now, or was it implemented properly, or what needs to improve in that regard?
I had a really hard time figuring out how the weights were going to help, for that very reason that we don't they're not tied to anything, and they're not based on a certain curriculum or change. So I guess that we just have to watch it carefully and see if we feel that this is helping.
Where we are in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
We don't even know where we are with Act 46, and that's been almost 10 years.
Right.
Whether that's been an improvement. Do you think that that's worked or not?
I couldn't answer that.
Yeah.
I think you're asking in terms of education, and that's really not my strength.
Yeah.
So, I've spent more time trying to figure out how to enable it through tax policy, but not in terms of the quality of education. That's not my field.
I understand. Yeah. It's complicated and difficult, almost as complicated as healthcare is, which is another mess. To go back though to the formula, to the foundation amount, if that foundation amount only provides for the lowest spending, only provides, which I thought I heard you say, the match the spending of currently the lowest spending districts in the state. Have we done anything to improve equity if we do that?
That's for the excess. So maybe the foundation amount is every district has the same tax rate, and they get the same foundation amount per pupil. So that's totally equal, assuming that the weighting is fair in determining how much money they get based on their weighted students. So that
should help.
That's there's no difference.
Yeah.
There, of course, we're back to your same question about if you're in a district with high property values, yes, you're going to pay more because it's the rate that we've equalized.
Yeah. What I'm thinking, and I'm not asking this very easily, is that, okay, let's take one district X, that the weighting went into place and they used the tax capacity to reduce taxes. And even though they did that and they put it before voters turned it down. Not once, not twice, 3 times. They turned down the spending proposals for that school district. So their spending per pupil was the lowest in the state. And their kids are not getting the resources they need. And now we've come along with a foundation formula, and we're going to give them the same amount per pupil as they passed in their last budget. Why on earth would we imagine that, regardless of what the scheme is for excess spending, that they would vote to spend any additional money over the minimum that they spent before this new proposal went into place?
When the foundation formulas running, they can't spend less than the foundation amount.
Yes,
So
that's exactly my point. So the foundation amount needs to be robust enough
yes,
to actually deliver
yes,
more equity. Is the governor's proposal is 13.5. I think Tammy Colby, who I respect for her knowledge about education funding, has suggested 15.5. What is the right foundation amount?
I don't know the right foundation amount, and that is the danger with the foundation formula, is that if what we're trying to do is hold taxes in line, then the foundation amount may be too low and may not keep up with the needs. And therefore you're forced into that, excess spending category.
Yeah, it's unequal, inherently unequal.
Well, the excess spending part will be equal in terms of between districts.
Yeah.
But basically, it's much more expensive. So, we just want to make sure that the foundation amount is adequate and does keep up with inflation and keep up with the true costs of education.
Yeah.
Right. Because it will be harder and harder for taxpayers to go into that excess spending category.
Which brings me to another thought, is one of the things that I tried to advocate for, both on the Ways and Means Committee when I was there and then on the Education Committee, is that these, whether it's education funding or any other numbers that we put into law, dollars, they should have inflators attached to them. I mean, this notion that the $47,000 threshold hasn't been changed for 30 years is ludicrous. Right. And so there should be some sort of inflator, I would think, on the foundation amount.
Right. The foundation amount itself, though, I think you can list the components or whatever and argue about that a little bit more, and that's sort of one number. But yes, you have to recognize that that has to change. It's the other little things that I think that we know that now, that every time you put a number into the statutes, that's going to change. The other thing that we know, but that we keep doing, is that we create these cliffs.
Yeah.
With like the 90,000 that we didn't change.
You earn $1 more or a couple $100 more, and all of a sudden your taxes double. That seems ridiculous policy.
Right. And so this proposal does the same thing. When it has it has its tax credits, which instead are a homestead exemption, so that some of your house value is exempt, but it goes by income, and it goes in those same kind of jumps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it doesn't solve that problem.
No.
Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. I hope that it's understandable to the public how complicated education finance is, on the one hand, but on the other hand, how it can be understood. And there are things that the legislature can do that make paying our taxes better and more effective than they have been. Although I think Act 60, 68 has done really a remarkable job in terms of providing equity across the state. That doesn't mean we're done. We've got more work to do, and I think that there is hope that if these proposals, whether they're foundation amounts or income-based amounts, my hope is that as it's being considered, we can actually improve things for Vermonters, for children in particular, and for communities and taxpayers. So I want to thank you very much for coming. Are there final comments you'd like to make?
No, only that foundation could work with income, essentially. And if you think income is a better indicator of your ability to pay taxes,
Yeah.
then that might help in raising the revenue that we need to provide the foundation amount.
Do the foundation amount, and then any excess spending could be on the income based. Is that what you're saying?
I'd do it all on income personally,
okay.
but until we have a property tax that includes all property,
Yeah.
such as financial assets, which are
We didn't
much
talk about
higher
that.
percentage
Yeah.
of your net worth than for higher income, but total net worth
Yeah.
is much higher percentages in financial assets than in property.
Is that ever going to happen? I mean, is there a way to get at wealth and assets like your stock, your 401k or whatever it is, your stock portfolio?
We haven't done it yet, but if you're talking about, yes, there are ways we can do this, I put it on the table, you know.
Oh, well, that's really good to hear, actually, because I think that I have not heard people say that, yes, there's a way to get at taxing wealth, assets other than the property that we have on the ground. So thank you for your thoughts. I much appreciate it, and I look forward to your work. I suspect you're not done, and I look forward to your work and your thoughts shaping the future as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave.
And thank you for joining us for another edition of Sharpe Takes. I hope this has brought a little bit of understanding to education finance. Thanks for joining us.